The title of the conference is Rapid Changes and New Challenges, and I can think of few moments when changes have been so rapid, so frequent, so sweeping. We're every day learning something new about how the media affects change. Everyone wants to know, is this a Twitter revolution, is it an internet revolution, etc. We are learning things that reinforce accepted wisdom and things that set accepted wisdom on its head. Our ideas about the structure of democratic practices is still evolving, and more relevant, our understanding of the role of media and information in producing and sustaining a robust democratic society. And that's what basically we're all about, trying to think about how media institutions, media change affects and sustains a robust democratic society. The organizers have asked me to speak about the relationship between media institutions and democratic values. And I regret I will not be here to hear the exciting discussions that take place these days in Erbil. The significant work on rights of journalists, on the application of international norms, on threats to the independence of the relevant agencies, on the important cases that exist before the courts here in Iraq and issues before the parliament. I wish I were more current on the matters that preoccupy a society redefining its media system and the relationship of the media system to political realities. In this morning's talk, which I hope is nicely brief, I want to take advantage of these unusual times to pose the question of media and democracy in a new way. I want to do this as a challenge to you, a challenge in the form of a question. Over the next months, your counterparts in the region, in Egypt and elsewhere, will be working diligently to reshape their media systems. We're all glued to the radio and television to find out what is occurring in these neighboring places. So here is the question. When it comes to thinking through what these new governments must do to restructure their media and information systems, does Iraq have anything to teach? If you were called, and maybe you already have been, to advise fellow journalists, fellow parliamentarians, fellow members of civil society in the region, those planning new laws and new institutions there, what would you tell them? What were the lessons learned from the last 8 years in Iraq? You have been pioneers in thinking about these questions, in living through massive change. What can you say? How would you capture the Iraqi experience and determine the lessons learned since 2003? Answering this question might help all of us understand better what steps, building what kinds of structures and institutions furthers realization of a more democratic society at home and abroad. I'm hardly a political scientist, but you might want to ask this question before your conversation with your regional counterparts. Are the differences between transformations in Iraq and in Egypt, for example, such that make the possibility of comparison remote? And this is something we know enough about, which is that if we're going to advise someone and say, here's what happened to us, we want to know what the differences were between our own experiences and those of the people we're advising. And there are great and extraordinary differences. Let's take the pre-uprising media institutions in Egypt. They were far more complex, perhaps, more advanced, somewhat more ready for change than those in Iraq pre-invasion and occupation. The dramatic methods and modes of change in 2011 were far different from the processes of invasion and occupation in Iraq in 2003. Egypt was or may have been a youth revolution. It's not clear to me that there was a youth revolution in Iraq in 2003 or something similar. That is to say, We don't know yet. We don't know whether this is a generational revolution in the region, and we don't know how that's reflected in Iraq. That's an interesting question in itself, which is this a myth about a youth revolution, or is it a universal, including in Iraq? In the region, there's this sense, true or not, that these are societies that have, quote, done it for themselves. Was this true for Iraq in 2003 as well? That is to say, what is the importance of this idea of self-achievement in terms of thinking about the development of democratic institutions? So, but these are differences, but there are very important similarities. Iraq faced in 2003 what the region faces now. And here are a couple of issues that you might think about reflectively. What kinds of media regulations and machinery would spring up to replace an old order? What should happen to the shell of state broadcasting? Should the head of state and officialdom be protected from insult and satire? How should the conversation to answer these questions be organized? Who should and must participate? And finally, what should be the signs of a new approach? What should symbolize that there's something new that is developing? What is the media system of the renewed or refashioned state? And how do these signs, that media system, reinforce democratic values? Now, I haven't walked where you have walked. I haven't had your lived experience with these questions, so I can only help suggest ways you might approach such an analysis. First, there's a fundamental question. Which media institutions should be examined for their contribution or lack of contribution to a stable, democratic, and pluralistic society? This is no longer an easy problem in itself. One would have to look within and outside Iraq at the great influence of satellite providers and the actions and the developers of social network sites. One would have to study the working of parliamentary committees and distant funders or donors in the media assistance sector. Of course, there's much else that's significant, very significant, including protecting the rights of journalists, providing an effective Freedom of Information Act, and creating a professional and committed journalism corps. For the purposes of this talk, I would suggest concentrating on two things: the transformation of the state broadcaster, in Iraq, the case of al-Iraqiyya, and the creation and regulation of private broadcasters and their regulation through the CMC. New authorities in the region, in Egypt and elsewhere, will face exactly these questions. What should happen to the state broadcasting apparatus? And if there's a burgeoning private sector or a new private sector, how should it be regulated? And later we'll turn to the question of social networking. I want to propose 5 perspectives that would be helpful, looking backwards and forwards, to ask how these media institutions evolve. From each perspective, one can ask what actions make an institution more or less effective in supporting the growth of a robust democratic state. These perspectives are formation. What were the institution's origins and did they confer legitimacy? Governance. Is governance effective and does it contribute to autonomy? Organization. Does the entity function in a way that demonstrates efficiency? And reception. How organizations perceive a policy. And finally, implementation. Did the policies actually get implemented and contribute to the health of the social order? I think it's a good way to organize the way we think about these questions. So I can't discuss each of these 5 characteristics: formation, governance, organization, reception, and implementation in detail. But I'll start with the issue of formation. And deal with it a little bit. My suggestion here, and this is why it's important for the region, is that early questions about legitimacy, about authenticity, about validity, about things that will have a long-standing relationship with the contribution to democracy, come from the very moment of formation. Origins cannot be easily obliterated. They haunt institutions and can affect their contribution to democratic development. So you could ask yourself, how did the Iraq media law come to be? Is there anything in that story of origins that would be useful in the post-uprising environments in the region? I think back to the Athens Conference of 2003 and the policy papers and statements that came out of it. I was fortunate to be there, but all of you may not know of it. In the early days of the post-invasion period, prominent Western NGOs from the US and Europe, for the most part, assembled in Athens with some Iraqi representatives from both within Iraq and the diaspora, and met to establish guiding principles for future media development in Iraq. The resulting document set the stage for what occurred later, not definitively, but in large part. It provided, as it were, the music, the background, the tone, or an anticipated or hoped-for tone for what was to come. This conference was important for several reasons. Largely, it's linked to the broader perspective of democratization in the Middle East. The Athens meeting sought to jumpstart a direction for Iraq media from what was already emerging in an unguided and harsh post-conflict environment. In those still optimistic times, goals included the flowering of instruments of communication, engendering robust speech, and providing a model for the region. This was to be all about civil society and the roles that non-government organizations play. Because the Athens Conference was to emphasize media democratization in the region in a certain way, it included representatives of various Arab journalists associations as well as government officials. But there were great shortcomings to Athens, shortcomings that echoed down the following months and years. Ironically, or perhaps tragically, it was hard to include more than a handful, if that, of indigenous Iraqi journalists, partly for security reasons, partly because of early concerns that journalists had that attending such a meeting would be interpreted as their collaboration with the West and with the occupier. The Athens Conference was hardly steeped in a sense of Iraqi history and Iraqi culture. There was a disconnect between emerging Iraqi politics and modes of thinking about media institutions. And I think this is another kind of very important caution for forthcoming discussions in the region. Will they be rooted in the particular details of the place, the particular culture of the place, the particular politics of the place? Or will they be, and to some extent they might be and should be, imposed or ideal ideas that come from accepted notions of what media systems should be? At any rate, this is part of the story of formation and origins of the Iraqi media system. It's also the case that other parts were important of formation. You can't divorce the formation of Iraqi media law from the role of the CPA and the role of Reconstruction. In some ways, that affected as well issues of legitimacy. And this may be less present in the discussions within the region. But to summarize, there were at least two areas of concern: the creation of a competitive broadcast market and a domestic regulatory agency, a kind of Iraqi Federal Communications Commission, or Ofcom, and the transformation of state television. One involved shaping an administrative structure for licensing and regulation. The other involved deciding what kind of institutions should emerge from the ashes of the former state monopoly. It'll be interesting in the region to see whether the same set of choices presents itself. That is to say, privatization and development of private media and changes in the state monopoly. It may be that these are not the choices that will develop, and that will be interesting in itself. So let me turn briefly to the other perspectives. I've talked about formation, but what about governance? Governance had a significant impact on the way media institutions contribute to democratic values. And surely there is much to learn from the Iraqi experience. In the early days, and probably continuing to the present, there has been a struggle over governance. How independent should al-Iraqiyya be? And how independent should the CMC be? This has been a matter of persistent, complex debate. And the quality of leadership has not been consistent or consistently high. Anyone from Iraq advising counterparts elsewhere would have to draw attention to this. And it's interesting to look elsewhere to see ways in which this issue of authority and quality of governance is developed. You can look at the United Kingdom, throughout Europe, throughout US. There are spotty results on each of these kinds of issues, but they are very, very important. What about organization? I think there's a lot to say as well, and it is connected to governance. Iraqi media institutions are affected or afflicted by basic structural problems. Issues of staffing, issues of financing, issues of vision and administration, relationships with the government, the parliament, the entities that are regulated. Frequent shifts in strategy, unclear lines of authority, conflicting messages about function, all of this has affected the quality of organization. This is not a problem for Iraq alone. This is a problem throughout the world. How do you make government function in a better way? What are the incentives that lead to greater productivity, greater dedication, greater following of mission? Another prism that I suggested is reception. How have the media institutions, not just the CMC and al-Iraqiyya, but the whole establishment of the media, been understood and accepted by the general public, by elected officials and by the industry? But I'll take the general public. Does the public consider that it's living in a society in which there is a fair allocation of channels, that there is the basis for getting information sufficient to vote in elections? How does the industry feel about its treatment by the institutions that govern? How citizens perceive media institutions will have, in the long run, an impact on whether those institutions can be sustained and can contribute to the deepening of democratic practices. One of the things that's been very interesting is to see opinion polls about the BBC. People don't mind paying the annual license fee to the BBC. They think this is an important element of their citizenship. They think that the BBC, and this is why the BBC is so great, in addition to its structure, it has a kind of bond with the population. This is very rare in the world, that people feel that they are, in a certain sense, getting their money's worth and are actually paying for a media structure. Do people think they're getting the right balance on critical questions? These are the issues for media institutions, as I say, particularly for public service broadcasters worldwide. This leaves the question of implementation. how would one objectively evaluate how media institutions perform in Iraq? There's now a kind of obsession with monitoring and evaluation, and this is done often to a fault, but I think it's not done sufficiently in this area. How can we think through whether or not institutions like the CMC or Al-Iraqiyya perform what they are supposed to perform? Did the CMC, or should the CMC, provide legitimacy to election processes, for example? Do people think that elections were fairer because of the adoption of rules and the administration of rules by the CMC? I'm not sure the CMC had fully that responsibility, but to the extent it did it perform it well? Did the CMC contribute to a sense of meaningful and open self-regulation in the media? In other words, is the media becoming a responsible media in an unregulated way because of the light regulatory approach of the regulatory institutions? Did the CMC contribute to a notion that there is an open and vital community of terrestrial broadcasters? So you could ask yourself, what has been the most valuable aspect of Al-Iraqiyya in terms of contributions to a sustainable democratic polity? Has it been a source of experimentation and programming? Has it contributed to the idea of a new and democratic Iraq? Has it been a site for reconciliation? Did it help did the CMC or Al-Iraqiyya help in this process of reconciliation and building a more coherent populace and polity? What about the creation and underwriting of Iraqi culture and identity? Especially at such critical moments as Iraq experienced post-invasion. The nourishing of language, of music, of theater, of literacy, all these could be significant. And I've mentioned that one of the key measures for thinking about the role of these institutions is how it functioned in the very vital democratic aspect of election cycles that define the legitimacy of successive Iraqi governments. What can we learn about that history that would be helpful in the region? So if I can say this, so these are the 5 prisms that I've mentioned, and how we can start thinking about Iraqi experience and use it as a leverage for helping to advise people in the region. There's a wealth of knowledge here in this room and in Iraq about building media institutions in great transformative moments. I've suggested ways of looking at this process through the prism of formation, governance, organization, reception, and implementation. I'm sure there are other means of thinking reflectively about the Iraqi experience, both for internal enhancement and for fraternal consumption. But a few concluding observations, and this perhaps turns to the technology question. Perhaps we are in a new technological world 10 years after Athens. Should the new designers for post-transformation media systems start with new premises? Were there structural flaws in building the Iraq Media Network, or Al-Iraqiyya? And were these really the right questions? There was a hope and a reality of turning the state broadcaster into more of a public service broadcaster. And much the same will mark the emerging discussions in the region. Our textbook criteria for public service broadcasters start with autonomy or independence of the governing board from government. But here's a question I'd like to ask. In the first 5 years of a transformed state broadcaster, are closer ties with government inevitable? Are there other models? Are there other models that we should look at in a world of many private stations, if that's what occurs? In a world of satellite broadcasting, is there a different role that state broadcaster or public service broadcasters should play? And of course, very important and a huge difference between 2003 and now is the role of the social media, of mobile phones and new patterns of creating and diffusing information. What is the relationship between unregulated satellite-delivered channels, often partisan, and domestic terrestrial channels? Is a domestic broadcasting system different in a period of active competition among satellite providers? In this changed environment, what are the essential structural laws that guarantee or help assure a vibrant journalistic community? In an age of bloggers, how does one rethink the profession? How does one rethink freedom of information laws, confidentiality of sources, protection from defamation, etc.? How does new technology affect the large elements of what might be called the standard media and democracy architecture story? In these new environments, how should the public service or public media, I think the term itself is a complicated term. Let's call it public service media be structured. Not public service broadcaster, not public service internet, not public service radio. Would the democratic impact of a transformed state broadcaster be different if its governing council were reimagined, its leadership was differently selected, and it had greater use of new media? Anyway, ultimately, Iraq and any state in the region functions in a globalized media environment. It must struggle with defining its own media system, knowing full well that how that system functions depends very much on what happens outside its boundaries. These dramatic days, that is hardly the point. What the region seems to have demonstrated is that there is still a major place for transformation and the shift towards more democratic values. I hope I have shown ways in which Iraqi voices can help idealists in the region and pragmatists understand the obstacles that lie ahead as they seek to shape a meaningful and democratic media system. Thank you.